Okay, this next case is a case of primary cutaneous, subcutaneous panniculitis-like T-cell lymphoma. So this is a biopsy that includes epidermis, dermis, and then a large component of subcutaneous tissue, as you can see. The epidermis and dermis are relatively spared, and there really isn't any significant changes noted in the epidermis or in the dermis, but beginning in the deep dermis, particularly in the subcutaneous tissue surrounding adnexal structures, as well as in the subcutaneous tissue proper, there appears to be a predominantly lobular pannicular infiltrate. There's relative sparing of the pannicular septae, as you can see, and the lobules are preferentially involved. And you can see involvement of the periappendigeal subcutaneous fat, because these are eccrine glands, and the subcutaneous fat surrounding these adnexal structures are involved with this infiltrate. So if we go in on higher power in the subcutaneous tissues, you'll see that the infiltrate is composed of predominantly lymphoid cells that have kind of round to oval shaped nuclei and inconspicuous nucleoli. You'll also notice a fair bit of karyorrhexis with cellular karyorrhectic debris that has been ingested in some instances by histiocytes. The atypical lymphoid cells have irregular nuclear contours, and they tend to have a fair amount of eosinophilic cytoplasm around them. They have hyperchromatic nuclei in some instances, and as I mentioned, ample eosinophilic cytoplasm, lots of karyorrhectic debris in the background, some of which has been engulfed by resident histiocytes. A few more examples of atypical lymphoid cells here. And what's a characteristic feature in this lymphoma is those atypical lymphoid cells appear to rim individual fat lobules. And so you'll see, individual fat cells, so you'll see adipocyte rimming with these atypical lymphoid cells. And there are multiple examples of that as we scan across the specimen. And we call this adipocyte rimming. What you also notice is that there isn't much in the way of inflammatory cells. Outside of the karyorrhectic debris, mostly what we see are some background histiocytes and lots of very atypical lymphocytes with hyperchromatic nuclei. We don't see a lot of plasma cells. This is another great example of rimming of that adipocyte here with atypical lymphoid cells. So the entire specimen, particularly in the subcutaneous tissue, is overtaken by this very atypical lymphoid infiltrate. Now I'm going to show you the stains. Now the composite cells in subcutaneous panniculitic-like T-cell lymphoma are CD8 positive cells, and they are cytotoxic cells. So they will express cytotoxic markers like TIA1 and granzyme B. So what I'm showing you here is the CD8 stain, and you'll see that most of those cells, particularly the cells that are rimming the fat cells, are CD8 positive, as you can see. So that's really important that all these atypical cells, or most of them, are CD8 positive lymphocytes. Now it's important to be aware that a big entity to consider in the differential is lupus panniculitis. And in that entity, usually you see more plasmacytoid dendritic cells, which are usually CD123 positive. You'll see clusters of those. You'll typically see hyalinizing fat necrosis, which we're not seeing here. But this is the CD8 stain. And then I'll show you the CD4 stain in contrast. And remember, there are a lot of histiocytes, so you will see some CD4 staining of histiocytes in the background, but you can see that there are many more cells in the background that are not picking up with the CD4. And the cells that are directly rimming the adipocytes that were CD8 positive are not necessarily positive for CD4. So this is a CD8 predominant T-cell lymphoma, and because it's predominantly involving the subcutaneous tissue, we would characterize this as CD8 positive subcutaneous panniculitis-like T-cell lymphoma. And there are other markers that I can show you, like the TIA1 and the CD56. Now, as I mentioned, these are cytotoxic T cells, so we would expect them to express cytotoxic markers like TIA1, and I'll show you what that looks like here. So this is the TIA1 marker, and once again, draw your attention to the cells that are rimming the adipocytes, and you'll see that the TIA1 is also staining those atypical lymphoid cells rimming the adipocytes. It tends to be a particulate stain, so you'll notice that it's very granular, but there's no mistaking the staining pattern of the rimming cells. And then I'd like to show you the granzyme B, which is another cytotoxic marker expressed by cytotoxic T cells. And you can see heavy staining of all of those atypical T cells, including the cells rimming the adipocytes. Now, these cells are usually alpha-beta T cells, so one other lymphoma to consider in the differential is cutaneous gamma delta T cell lymphoma. Those are T cells that express the gamma delta T cell receptor. So this is TCR, or T cell receptor beta F1, which represents the alpha beta receptor. And you can see that these cells, again focusing on the ones rimming the fat lobules, are alpha beta positive. So they're TCR beta F1 positive. And then this is CD56, which we expect to be negative in this lymphoma, but positive in cutaneous gamma delta T cell lymphoma. So this is the CD56, and it's negative as expected. If we were to have a TCR delta or gamma delta stain, we'd be able to show that it would be negative in this T cell population. So the correct diagnosis here is subcutaneous panniculitis-like T cell lymphoma. Inflammatory conditions to consider in the differential is lupus panniculitis, and usually you would see epidermal interface change and more dermal involvement with a lymphoid infiltrate, clusters of plasmacytoid dendritic cells, and hyalinizing fat necrosis in lupus panniculitis. None of those features would be noted in SPTCL. And then other lymphoma subtypes to consider in the differential is cutaneous gamma delta T cell lymphoma with predominantly pannicular involvement. Can definitely mimic SPTCL. The key is to look for CD56 positivity in gamma delta T cell lymphoma and positivity for T cell receptor gamma delta in gamma delta T cell lymphoma.